very much all for coming over on a cold and slightly foggy morning to come to this panel. We apologize for the very early start, but that's beyond our control. I am Charles Raab from the University of Edinburgh, and I'm chairing the panel. Ivan Szekely over there from the Central European University in Budapest will be the moderator, the question and answer person who will direct the panel. We hope to keep the discussion and the questions going until 10 o'clock or a little bit after, when the bell ringer comes to clear us off. Now, we have a very excellent and well-qualified panel to discuss the relationships between data protection authorities and the media, both the traditional media and online. And we will introduce the panel members individually later on when they come up to speak. But two of them come from the world of the DPAs, and one of them from the world of journalism, and one who knows a lot about social media and the internet. So we think we've covered a good spectrum of walks of life and opinion and so forth. Now, over several years, Ivan and I have regularly produced panels for the CPDP on data protection authorities in relationship to various things, such as their independence, their cooperation with each other, their relationship with NGOs and activists, and also the way they try to keep up to speed about information technology. As a matter of fact, we published an article based on a survey we did. I can give you details of that later on, an article with charts and tables showing comparatively how different data protection authorities across Europe keep up to date, up to speed about information technology. Now, this year we decided to focus on data protection authorities and the media, partly because it might be becoming increasingly important as data protection and the use of personal data evolve into new departures and new relationships, and partly because this very specific subject of DPAs relating to the media is only rarely put into any kind of spotlight, neither in academia or in other conferences on privacy and data protection. So we thought that it was a good time to focus upon this. Of course, as for the CPDP, there's been plenty of talk about the media. There are two panels today, further two panels today at least, on aspects of the media content regulation, and that may be of interest to you. Immediately following this one, there's one on freedom of expression and so forth. And if anybody was here who went to the privacy camp on Monday, that was about disinformation, misinformation, and fake news, and so on. So there's a bit of a kind of focus upon the media going through the Brussels conferences this week. Now, the media literally mediate. They go between individuals and organizations, and between groups of people, and online, even between individuals themselves. But they're far more than that, because most people get their knowledge and get their information, their understanding or misunderstanding from the media of all kinds, online and traditional press and traditional broadcasting. Media are very powerful shapers of opinions. You know, we get to know what we think we know through the media, or sometimes things are missing in the media that we find out about later on. So they play a very pivotal role, but they also have skin in the game. They're far more than just mediators. They have their own interests to pursue, of course, and in that sense, the media themselves are very often the source of privacy problems, even though, wearing their other hat, they are the organizations that bring us information about other people who are breaching privacy. So it's a very complicated and complicated set of relationships and roles that they have. Therefore, we need to understand, I think, a little bit more about this Janus-faced role of the media, and also to understand how DPAs, as privacy protectors and regulators, interact with the media. How well do they get on with each other? What do these relationships depend upon? What are the consequences in terms of strengthening or weakening data protection or privacy? Do the media and DPAs compete for the support of the public, or are they allies on the side of the public interest in privacy and data protection? And are there important national differences and variations across countries in Europe and elsewhere? Well, exploring such questions is what this panel is supposed to be doing. There is, of course, a journalistic exemption in data protection law, but the pros and cons of that issue is not what interests us in this particular panel. As I mentioned, there are other panels in which that kind of thing will be going into. Let me now hand over to Yvonne, who first wants to ask the audience a question.
Yes, there will be a quick voting session because we are really interested in your opinion, and we do hope that you will share your opinion with us. So there will be several blitz voting sessions during this panel discussion. This is the first one. So there's a question and 3 options. So in general, do you think that in today's world, in the GDPR era, so to say, the media should cover the DPA's activities more? Because now this concerns almost everybody. Option 2, the media should cover the DPS activities less until their practice is established, so we should grant them a kind of grace period. Or option 3, only outstanding cases should be covered, nothing else, that the public can understand. So who would vote for option 1? The majority. Okay, very good. We don't form a kind of statistical sample, but we take note of the majorities. Okay, who votes for option 2, grace period? No one. Okay. And who would vote for option 3, only the outstanding cases? Just a few people. Okay. Thank you. So I hand over to Charles again. We will switch the roles during the whole panel.
Our first speaker is Jennifer Baker. I won't attempt to tell you too much about her. Her brief bio is on the screen, but she has worked as a journalist in radio, TV, and print for about 20 years and specializes in EU policy and legislation. She's incredibly well networked around the place, and she understands her way around the whole labyrinth of EU institutions. And is a very highly skilled communicator, as we will find out just now. So over to you, Jen.
Thank you, Charles. Thanks, everyone, for getting up so early this morning. Because I'm the media representative on this panel, that's kind of an awkward position to find oneself in, because you're sort of defending the indefensible in today's current world. But I want to start off by, before we discuss the relationship between media and other organizations, you need to understand that I'm talking specifically about news media, not car magazines. We are an industry in crisis, possibly the death knell, sort of final throes of this entire industry. So it's very difficult to sort of stand and defend what used to be a really sort of ethical profession, and which I feel personally is no longer even holding together as a profession anymore. So I started out in print newspapers, old-fashioned, actual print newspapers. There was no internet. There was, barely computers in some of the newsrooms I worked in when I first started out. And it was popular because what we were, which no one really credits, we were news aggregators even back then. Because people, you could get your news from talking to your neighbours. People in small towns could find out what was going on. But newspapers collated and defined what was newsworthy in the same way that news aggregators today do. And it was a license to print money, they used to say. And what happened was the publishing houses became very, very addicted to those profits. We used to make profit margins of about 60%. Now, I mean, that's kind of unbelievable in today's society, that you would make that much money out of doing something so very, on the face of it, very, very simple. And I mean, different times. I mean, you know, you look back even 100 years at sort of big print media, it's very patriarchal, it's very top down, it's very, we will define for you what you, the plebs and the public, should know and should care about. And I don't want to go back to those days, and I don't even think that 60% profit margins are defensible when you're paying your staff so relatively little. So where did it all start to go wrong? And it's very easy to point the finger of blame at the internet. But that's what I'm going to do anyway. Spoiler alert. But why our industry really struggled is difficult to understand unless you look at that shareholder value. Because other industries faced similar problems. You look at the music industry, the gaming industry, the entertainment industry, and many of them had similar problems in trying to understand how to work with this new medium, this internet. And the music industry in particular struggled. They, you know, that's why we have all these copyright debates, these fraught copyright arguments, and you know, laws defending the rights of rights holders, because they were afraid their product was being shared for free. The games industry, the computer gaming industry, they looked at the internet and thought, aha, we are going to get way more customers. We're going to use this. I mean, maybe because they had tech people, you know, nerds nerd harder, and they understand where the internet is going. And so they saw this as a massive opportunity. Bizarrely, my industry looked at this and thought, we'll give away our product for free. Now, in what world is that a good idea? You know, if you sell chips, you don't decide, we're going to give away our chips for free, but we're going to hope that people will read the advertising on the packaging. But that, incredibly, is what the news industry did. Newspapers decided, oh, we want one of those website thingies. We'll put our core product, which is news, on it for free. And it undermined the whole value system of what we were selling and what we were trying to do. It undermined the professionalism and the ethical responsibility of journalists, because suddenly we were told, you are nothing more than a vessel for selling advertising. And certainly, even when there were print newspapers, there was a certain amount of advertising. There's no denying that. There were always classifieds. There was, you know, there was always some lovelorn farmer willing to pay 20 quid to put an advert in saying he was looking for a wife. And people, that was fine. But that was alongside the news. The news was still the core product. So this, I feel, is where we fundamentally went wrong. Now, certainly there are various publications trying to row back on that now. There's an effort with micropayments. There's an effort with subscriptions. But it's a little bit like trying to bolt the stable door after the horse has bolted. People have gotten used to getting their news for free. There is no longer, and as again, I'm not arguing for going back to this sort of top-down, sort of patriarchal structure that you must only consume the news that we think is newsworthy. But it also has undermined the ethical responsibility of reporters. And it's a full-time job. Okay, my God, 3 minutes already. That is why we're in the crisis situation we're in. So we got hooked on advertising. And worse than getting hooked on advertising, which obviously means this pursuit of eyeballs, which created this clickbait sort of attitude towards news gathering and news selling, we got hooked on programmatic or problematic advertising, this behavioral tracking advertising. So no longer are we even part of a value chain that says we have something that you might be interested in, even if the way we're paying for it is difficult. It's no longer a ethical responsibility of a reporter to say, here's the news, this is what we have a responsibility, we take our ethics seriously, and we are, speaking truth to power, holding the powerful accountable. We're no longer even doing that. And we are just trying to just get you to look at something so we can sell you back to the advertisers, which has led to a kind of breakup of what was traditional news reporting. And this is where it probably gets interesting for DPAs to understand where we're coming from. Negativity sells. It always has. If it bleeds, it leads. And that's even more true in today's clickbait world. But we now have a sort of break-up of what I might call, what used to be called anyway, niche publishing. This sort of idea that, well, you're a tech publisher. I'm a freelancer, so I can stand here or sit here and say this without fear that my employer is going to go, you're giving away all our secrets. And so I'm not, beholden to a big publisher. And I work in the niche area of privacy publishing, where we are expected to really know the DPAs well, understand, and we're not talking to the general public in the sense that, my mum has to understand what this is about. But because I come from that old background, I still very strongly feel that if it's not understandable by the average individual, we're at a loss. And it's not because I'm trying to sell eyeballs, but it's also because the competition for someone's attention is different than it was 20 years ago when we started and we all learned our craft, or not all of us learned our craft, but I learned my craft. And so I think the relationship between the DPAs and journalists has to be predicated on knowing who the journalist's audience is, who the media is. And it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not DPAs talk to a journalist, we're all after one thing, we all want the scandalous story, although we do. But we also have, I feel, a duty to explain and inform, and yes, entertain, because unfortunately that's the way the world is now, and if it's not entertaining, people won't read it. So I didn't vote in that first three-pointer, but if I had, I would have voted for the last one, because I think we don't dilute the stories by just covering everything, because you will just lose people's attention. If you focus on the stories that are interesting and important and actually tell a truth about the larger ecosystem, then you will get readers, you'll get audience, and you'll get the advertising and the payment at the end of the day that goes along with it.
Okay, may I have a question to you? As we know, the DPAs have some 20 different tasks specified in the GDPR, with the usual last one, that any other task in connection with the protection of personal data. But still, I'm talking about the mainstream media, the only sort of big news, or the only visible news for the average reader, is when a DPA is imposing fines under the GDPR against certain data controllers. Just lastly, the 50 million euros against Google. Yes. So in your opinion, the readers or the general audience of such mainstream media, do they have a sort of moral or emotional reaction to all these news, or is just a kind of dry, uninteresting official piece of news for them, well, if you publish something like this?
I think obviously that Keneal fine was interesting because of who was being fined. If it was some sort of small French organization that the wider world had never heard of, it probably would have not been noticed. So I think people's visceral reaction is oh, it's Google, and then, well, money, and then, oh, but wait, that's not a lot of money for Google. So I mean, I'm a reader, I'm a consumer of media, and I kind of reacted in the same way. When I write about that story, I try to focus on the idea that it's not just about the money, but that is what people think about. It's about whether they will be forced to change their practices. But that's only of interest to a small segment of the readership. Most people don't read beyond the first paragraph.
Okay, and if a hospital is fined, what that happened in the Portuguese case, what would be the reaction of your readers? A fine against a hospital, which is quite different from Google.
Yeah, I mean, I think what people who use a hospital are going to see that in a very different way. If you've recently been in there and you think, oh my goodness, hospital. I don't want my urinary tract infection to be shared with everybody. I mean, then, that's you've got to hit people on an emotional level and tell the human story if you want people to read beyond the first paragraph. Hospitals are difficult because hospitals provide a service. No one really wants to see a hospital fined. But the way to hook them on that story is to think, what if you were ill? What if your data was breached?
Thank you. And the next voting, very quick voting. There's an exception for the journalists, for the media in the GDPR. In your opinion, is it too wide, option 1, because it opens the door to privacy infringements? Option 2, it's too narrow because it unreasonably restricts the media, the workspace of the media. And option 3, it's just fine because journalism ethics And court practice have been able to cope with these cases so far quite well. Who would vote for option 1? It's too wide. Hmm? That's a good question. These blitz voting questions are too general, oversimplified, just to have a general idea about your interest. There will be a bit provocative voting question about a country where this journalism exception was perhaps abused or from the part of the DPA. So who would vote for option 1? The present exception is too wide. Yes. Yes, very brave vote. Who would vote for it's too narrow because it limits the workspace of the media? Who would vote for option 2? Again, 1. And who would vote for option 3? Yes, the majority, and most of you didn't give a vote, so you abstained. And anyway, it's a tricky question, but without going into detail, I would hand over to Charles.
Thank you. That's Goldilocks and the Three Bears. The next speaker is just immediately to my right, and Steve Wood, and you can again see about Steve there. He is Deputy Commissioner of the ICO, Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, where we live in interesting times, not only about the obvious big B, but also about aspects of data protection and privacy, which have made headline news over the last few years. So over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Charles, and I'm very pleased to be here talking about this topic, actually, which I, in my 12 years at the ICO, have never actually had to talk about this area as a dedicated topic. So I think the first thing to recognise with the interaction between DPAs and the media is that, obviously, as already been said, they're a crucial way through which we, the DPAs, reach the public. So they're a crucial channel that we've got to think about, engage with, learn about and understand, but equally we'll recognise that the media are there to hold us to account. It's an important part of a democratic society. They will ask us difficult questions and we have to respect and understand that. What I'm going to talk about today really is particularly my last year at the ICO, which in my 12 years at the ICO was probably the most turbulent and busy year and probably the most high-profile year in the ICO's history. So we had really the triple combination in a way, as well as a twin combination of GDPR and the Cambridge Analytica Facebook story, and then we added something to make it a triple whammy, which was Brexit. And how we cope with all of those different stories and issues, which you can see playing round on the slides which are looping round, shows how the ICO has to engage with the media to actually be effective in the 21st century. And very much the story of 2018 for the ICO was of opportunity. So it was exploiting the opportunity of GDPR coming into force, about getting the messages out we wanted to, about the new rights that citizens enjoyed, about using that opportunity to get the messages out to organisations to raise the standards of data protection, to use the opportunity of the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal to enhance the profile of data protection and privacy and to get a debate going in the media, to exploit that, to get those key messages out was an opportunity. But equally as well, we knew there was going to be that negative sort of sidetrack of stories, which, you know, one headline was that the GDPR was bureaucratic, expensive, and stifling innovation, and many different variants on those stories. And we had to tackle that aspect. But actually, I think the story in the UK last year was actually the year that the UK media woke up to data protection rights. And actually, I think in some ways, a combination of factors, which hopefully the ICO played its role in, was the media waking up to the importance of data protection as a consumer right and also as an important right related to the democratic society, thinking about the role that personal data played in election campaigning. So what approach do we take as a DPA to tackle this ever-changing landscape that we have to interact with? The first thing to say is we have a communication strategy. And we have a well-resourced and dedicated department at the ICO. We're a large DPA where we're nearly at 700 staff, and we have a communications department of over 20 people. Our strategy is proactive, so we have a planned strategy of key messages. So something like the GDPR, we had 2 years to prepare that. We had time to prepare and plan the messages we wanted to put out. But equally as well, you can't plan completely for something like Cambridge Analytica. So you've got to be agile, you've got to be reactive, you've got to be quick on your feet to be able to deal with issues like that. In terms of our approach to GDPR, we knew that it was very important we got the balance of what we call carrot and stick messages. So we wanted to balance the messages about the ICO's authority and our increased powers to fine, equally with messages which were going out particularly to small businesses and organisations who needed the help and support to get right and prepare for GDPR. So we had to push enforcement messages, but equally balance that with messaging about actually helping organisations get things right, demystify, and actually give the impression that GDPR was something that businesses could engage with, it could integrate into their business practice, and it was not something which would break their business model. We also sought to give messages around individuals' rights, so we launched a campaign called Your Data Matters, which actually sought to give messages through sort of illustrations and through graphics and images online about how individuals' rights matters and how they could empower them. And we used that branding throughout our GDPR campaign. As also, I guess, some disinformation and myths started to appear, particularly around the areas of fines, and I think all DPAs across Europe experienced this, of the messaging that some in the trade press particularly wanted to pick up on, some of it I think peddled by consultants who wanted to sell services, that small businesses would be put out of businesses, that £1 million fines would even be levied on very small organisations, or myths about consent was the only legal basis for processing personal data. But at the ICO, we convened a series of blogs on our website, which we called myth-busting blogs. So we did a myth-busting blog about fines. We did a myth-busting blog about consent, which actually were very easy packages for the media to pick up on and actually translate into key messages, which then actually led to myself going on a mainstream radio channel, Radio 5 in the UK, to be able to speak about messages for small businesses and demystify. And that was a very good opportunity we were able to get from that. We also had to deal with Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, so I'll talk a little bit about that now. And for the ICO, the challenge was the volume of media queries we got as well, I think. So having a well-resourced and dedicated and professional communications team for us was vital, because one misplaced message or one quote which went out from an ICO spokesperson could have damaged all of the good work we were doing in getting the messages out about how the ICO was investigating, was acting on behalf of the public, and was getting to the bottom of the issues, and also about the enforcement action we subsequently took. So the volume of messages we had to put out was also very high in terms of having to react to different stages of the investigation. And the international attention was something which was fairly unprecedented for us as well, particularly the attention we got from the US. Actually, the challenge for us with the Cambridge Analytica Facebook issue was also actually that we had a number of wider messages, and it wasn't all about Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. We actually investigated 30 organizations as part of our investigation into political data. And you can see the story there on that slide, which has just appeared on the screen. And actually, we wanted to get some wider messages out about the whole life cycle about how political data was used, the role of data brokers, because we find a data broker as well as part of that investigation, and the investigations we made into political parties. So we had to work very hard also to get the wider messages so that the narrative wasn't just about the thing that the media would normally always gravitate straight towards, which obviously was the story around Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. The other interesting angle for us as well, particularly thinking about the role of the Guardian newspaper in this as well, we were dealing with the media in a traditional way. They were asking us questions, we were putting spokespeople up and dealing with them. But equally as well, there was a whistleblower in play. So there was a whistleblower in Christopher Wiley, and other whistleblowers came forward. And that actually was another dimension, that the media were speaking to a whistleblower and getting information from him, and we wanted to speak to the whistleblower. That, and again, created another interaction with the media that we had to learn, I think, and manage in perhaps a way we hadn't had to before. Lastly, we're going to talk about Brexit. So Brexit is obviously a highly politicised issue, and we're an independent data protection authority, independent of government, doing our job to protect UK citizens and wanting to actually get on and continue doing that job and to have continuity during a time of Brexit. So equally, we want to keep away from the political discussions and not get drawn into that, and that has been quite difficult when we've had a lot of questions from media asking us to comment about different implications of data protection and Brexit. So we've chosen our opportunities very carefully about when we want to communicate about Brexit, but always emphasising key messages about the importance of continued protection of citizens' personal data, whatever form of Brexit we have, and also getting messages out in the last few months about a no-deal Brexit, which we feel is part of our job as a data protection authority, to help businesses prepare for that possible scenario. So always emphasising the practical messages, again having to do some myth-busting as well, is the key area. Lastly, the other area we do have to grapple with, and the sign's up, so I'll finish my sentence, is regulating the media itself, as Charles has already alluded to. That's a subject for another panel, but equally that does create some tension in the relationship sometimes, because we're dealing with the media with so many different hats on, and that's the skill we have to learn about being agile and always thinking in what capacity we're dealing the media with, always thinking about what messages and what capacity we're focusing on when we're working with them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve.
I have a question to you again. All your examples were about the data protection and privacy protection field from two of your main domains you are supervising, both data protection and freedom of information or access to public information. Without the hype, and of course we are at a CPDP conference, a Computers, Privacy and Data Protection Conference, but after the hype of the GDPR, or before the hype, which domains were more interesting for the media? The personal data protection part or the access to public information part, or maybe the potential conflicts?
I think the spotlight has naturally gravitated towards data protection and privacy, probably over the last 5 years in the build-up to GDPR, with the rise of technology and concerns about transparency of personal data processing and all of the different sort of scandals and issues that have arisen. So certainly for the ICO, about 80% of our work is focused on data protection and privacy, and probably 20% is focused on access to information. So actually what we have to do actually is be very careful that we don't almost exclusively focus on data protection and privacy, and we do create the space for access to information, because that area is now, I think, less new for the media in the UK. So it was a big issue when our Freedom of Information Act came into force in 2005. And actually we have to work quite hard now to get the profile for freedom of information in the UK. We actually did a report to Parliament this week. So we presented a report to Parliament on extending the Freedom of Information Act to private contractors delivering public services this week. And actually that was quite a proactive intervention to keep the media interested in freedom of information. So certainly the balance and the interest has been towards that over the last 5 years, and it's our job, given we regulate both pieces of legislation, to ensure they're both priorities, and there we'll develop that with our media strategy to make sure that the messages are out there.
Thank you. The audience cannot escape from my voting questions, so another quick vote. Should the DPAs in general establish a close, privileged relationship with the media? Option 1, yes, because the media can contribute to the efficiency of privacy protection. No, because DPAs deal with data subject and data controllers, not intermediaries, and should keep some distance from the media. Option 3, only in case if the media is bringing privacy violations to the attention of the DPA. Who would vote for option 1? Yes, you are very optimistic, and that the media should have a special relationship. Who would opt for option 2? A few, yes. And who would vote for option 3? No one. No, oh yes. Okay, so only in special cases, but otherwise not. Okay, then without going into details, let's continue with Charles again.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker also comes from the world of the DPAs, Gysen, who works for the European Data Protection Board, EDPB, and she's had long experience as a press advisor at the European Parliament for over 12 years. So I'll turn over to her to talk about it from her perspective.
Thank you, Charles. I'll pick up, if I can get my PowerPoint started.
Yes.
Let me pick up where Jennifer left off. The question about what drives the news. What drives the news is what's newsworthy. And from a communications service or communications person's point of view, that means that especially when you're dealing with technical issues, you need to make them accessible, understandable, and secondly, you need to make them relevant. Making them relevant is a battle that's been largely won already in the case of the GDPR. It's a lot more, data protection and data protection issues and rights are much more in the attention of the general media than they were 5 or 6 years or even longer ago. Explaining it and making it understandable is something that we have to do day after day, especially at the EDPB, where we have 2 different types of media that we deal with. We get questions from mainstream media when there is a revelation or in the lead up to the 25th of May, but we also deal with a set of journalists that had a very in-depth knowledge of data protection issues. So we're constantly juggling in getting the message in a shape that is relevant to these journalists. What we do a lot, I'll start off with giving you an example. Steve said that he had to do that too, is myth busting. There is still a lot of misunderstanding about what the board is and what we do, what our competences are, which is normal given that we've only been around since May last year. So we get a lot of confusion, and I think about 30% of the questions I get are about clarifying mistakes and misunderstandings about what we do. So what the European Data Protection Board is not, is we're not the same as EDPS. EDPS, we're in the same building, but EDPS is a supervisor that monitors the data processing activities of the European institutions, whereas we are all the national DPAs together with the EDPS and with the Commission in the role of an observer. We're also not our predecessor, Working Party 29, which had a largely advisory role. We have that advisory role, but on top of that we can take binding decisions, and we are aiming to greater consistency across Europe. And then what we're definitely not is a super regulator. That's one that we get almost every day. We're not one step above the DPAs. No, we are all the DPAs together, not just in the European Union, but also in the European Economic Area. So I've said it already, what we are is an independent European body with a legal personality. We can sue, we can be sued. We're composed of the supervisory authorities with EDPS and the Commission, and we have 3 main roles. Here I come back to what I said in the beginning, making it relevant. This is a statistic that the Commission brought out last week. Despite all the big stories and around Cambridge Analytica and the Zuckerberg hearings in the Senate and in the European Parliament, GDPR still attracted 3 times as much coverage as Mr. Zuckerberg himself. So the amount of questions we have to deal with is frankly overwhelming sometimes. I didn't bring them because I would have needed a trolley to actually wheel them over here, but we started keeping actual physical clips of not the GDPR, but the European Data Protection Board, and it's like 3 books like this with coverage just about the European Data Protection Board and the chair and the vice chairs. So when Steve says they have a communications team of 70 people, I'm very jealous because at the Secretariat it's 2 people for the time being. So, and we don't only deal with media, although media is very central to what we do. We interact with 3 different audiences. The media, like I said, but we also get a lot of questions directly from individuals, from the general public. They email us, they phone us, and we try to answer them too. And then we deal with professional organizations that represent a certain sector, the healthcare sector or telecom sector, that talk to us. They want to know, they want to find out and interact with the board about specific guidance that we're issuing. We interact with these 3 groups on social media, on Twitter and on LinkedIn. And of course, what's very important is that most people, they find out their news through the media. So the general public, they read the mainstream news and they find out when there's big stories, big revelations linked to Facebook, Google, and so on. But the stakeholders, that last group, they have their, it's very often media behind a paywall, but they have their more technical, specialized media that they follow very attentively to find out about data protection issues. So in the very beginning, I read a question there whether some of the anti-GDPR media and so on, at the board level, we haven't been confronted with that a lot. The media is very much helping us in achieving our objective, which is to explain data protection issues better and to explain better what the board does. Some challenges for journalists. I think Jennifer will recognize a lot of this. It's the same for every reporter all over the world. The news cycle is non-stop. It's 24 by 24, 7 on 7. Short deadlines as a result of this non-stop news cycle, which means there's not enough time for in-depth research, which means that journalists have to speak to a person that they know will get them the news thereafter and explain it to it in a understandable way so that they don't have to start looking for different sources and try to do some extra reading themselves, which already they often don't have the time for. So what we aim to do at the Secretariat of the Board is to become a kind of European hub for communications. We've established a network of communications officers in all the DPAs across Europe and Liechtenstein, Norway, and Iceland. And when we get a question from a journalist that's actually not something that's within the competence of the board, we field it to ICO or to CNIL or to our Irish colleagues or to whoever is concerned, and vice versa. The colleagues in the DPAs, they keep us informed of stories that are breaking in their country, and when they get something that's more within the competence of the board, they send it our direction. Like I said, we really try to distinguish between general media and specialized media. We try to be proactive by making sure that the news we get to these different sets of reporters is relevant to them. Okay, thank you. And when we're reactive, when we're getting questions, we're really aware of the deadlines of the journalists, which are very short. So we focus a lot on speed of delivery. In practice, this means it's not brain surgery. It's the same for every single spokesperson working in the European institutions or elsewhere. We use the classical channels of communications. We have a website that we try to keep as much up to date as possible. Any decision by the board is published on there as soon as it's available, which means as soon as the whole board has decided and the necessary legal checks have happened. We send out regular press releases, especially after plenary sessions. We also live tweet during the plenary sessions to make sure that the news is out there even quicker. We use the social media also to do a lot of myth-busting, like Steve is doing at ICO, and we invite the colleagues from the DPAs to send us blogs and to tell us about issues they're working on, which then we share within the Euro bubble here in Brussels. The media is not our only audience. We try to engage very actively with our stakeholders. We do this through stakeholder workshops. We'll have 2 coming up in the coming months, and we will carry out a stakeholder survey, asking our stakeholders about the guidance, whether it was useful to them and what was missing, what could be done better, and so on. And then we participate in conferences, of course. And one last thing, the communications network is not just about fielding questions. We also publish the news from the member states on our EDPB website. So in conclusion, just a few conclusions from work in the 9 past months at EDPB. Transparency is key. We really try to be very open and communicate proactively about what we do. There is still, like I said in the beginning, about 30% of our work is getting the understanding right about what the EDPB is and what we do. The network has been proven very successful and very helpful to journalists. We get it a lot, that's very useful to them. And then, like I started off, the awareness has definitely gone up, which is helpful, but which also means that we have sometimes an avalanche of questions that we need to deal with.
Thank you for this very rich presentation, and I'm sure that the audience will have questions to you after the series of individual presentations. Just a technical question. The number of mentions of the GDPR in the press is really impressive, indeed. Do you have a similar statistics about the EPDP's mentions in the press. It's not a competition. You can't compete with GDPR, but still.
It's several. I don't have the exact number with me because I didn't, like I said, I didn't bring my clipping books. But we keep actual Excel sheets, and it's pages and pages and pages. So it runs into the thousands.
So the EDPB itself is mentioned.
Yes, yes. It's
as
when the
body.
board is mentioned, not just the individual DPAs, but the board, or when the chair has given an interview, and she's done hundreds of them in the past months.
Okay, thank you. So I'm afraid we still have, if I find, that was you, yes. So we still have a voting question. If I can move the slideshow, that's becoming difficult. Can I get, that's what's missing, I'm sorry. Yes, that's a bit provocative. Maybe you have heard about this story. A European DPA recently threatened investigative journalists with imposing fines, high fines, under the GDPR in case if they do not reveal their sources in a corruption case, the individuals, the names of the people who acted as a source. In your opinion, is it right? Because journalists should also observe data protection regulation. Option 2, this is wrong because journalists represent the public interest in such cases. And option 3, this is out of the question because the written and unwritten rules protect journalistic sources anyway. So who would vote for option 1? This is right because journalists should should observe the data protection rules in such a case. Okay. Okay. Option 2, is it wrong? 1 or 2 or 3 votes. And option 3 is not a question because the journalistic sources are protected anyway. Okay, the great majority voted for this. Charles, please.
Thanks very much. Our final speaker is Balazs Bodo, who is a well-known academic, a socio-legal researcher at the University of Amsterdam Institute for Information Law. And he has worked quite a lot on internet technologies and has published quite widely. So I'll just turn over to Balazs as our fourth speaker.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation, Ivan and Charles. I'm a little bit the odd one out because my research is not particularly focused on the activities of the data protection authorities, but I think I managed to find an angle that that has been raised in these discussions before, and which also relates to my research on different modes of regulation and different modes of trying to achieve the policy goals that the GDPR and DPAs are tasked to achieve. And the question for me is very familiar from my studies from economics, where I got fascinated with the power and the ability of central bankers to actually regulate through words, speaking to the markets about expectations, about goals, about trends, about possible interventions, seems to be an incredibly powerful tool in the regulatory tool set of central bankers in actually achieving their policy goals. So I started to think in preparation for this panel of despite all the differences between the two fields, monetary regulation by central banks and data regulation by DPAs, is there what kind of what can we learn, or what can the DPAs learn from central bankers? So when they speak, the markets listen. So it's a subset of what Geert discussed, because it's a very particular approach to communicating with the media or communicating with the stakeholders in order to achieve the same goals that can also be achieved much more expensively through investigations, through fines, so through having investment into enforcement. And the key to that is, of course, transparency, as you've also mentioned. And it's very interesting to see how transparency changed as a central bank policy tool. And this is a quote from Alan Greenspan from the early 90s, where the central banks were not very transparent, and they didn't think that transparency in policy matters would matter as a policy tool. So in a congressional hearing, he said, I've learned to mumble with great incoherence, so if you seem unduly clear to you, you must have misunderstood what I've said. So the whole idea of central bankers or regulators talking to the markets was all about obscuring their intentions. Now that has changed, and someone who has grown up in the 90s and early 2000s in the Greenspan era, I remember how much weight, not just specialized press, but actually everyday press, attributed to the words or these disclosures of Alan Greenspan and other central bankers, trying to decode and understand what was the meaning of their words and what kind of consequences that would have to the market. And this shows that this can be a super powerful policy tool. So actually, and a super cheap policy or enforcement tool, the credibility of the DPAs created through the transparency. Now, there has been lots of research on what are the components of this type of institutional transparency, this which creates credibility for the stakeholders, for the citizens, for the data subjects and other constituents of the public. And these are pretty well researched. So there is economic transparency, that the authority is able to prove to the markets that they understand what's happening there. And they understand, they have the data, they have the model, they have the proper forecasts, so they understand the issues there. They have a political transparency, so there are clear objectives about the point of the regulation. There are clear targets set. There are clear institutions with clearly defined responsibilities. There is a procedural transparency within the organization of how strategy is made, how decisions are made, how votes on certain decisions are reached, which creates not just a policy coherence, but it's a policy transparency where there are clearly defined decisions which are clearly explained to all the stakeholders through various modes of communication. And there is a clear and transparent approach to their enforcement and implementation. So these are the transparency elements which can all be created, and I guess this is one of the parts of your job description and Steve's, to actually create these types of transparencies through various modes. So, like, what are the modes of communication? And you've described a much wider set of communication responsibilities. In that sense, it seems like that the central bankers are much more sparse in talking to markets, but they hold regular press conferences and issue regular bulletins with which they focus these type of activities on. And it's very clear that they have a very clearly defined content of their communication. So they, and if you go back and listen to Mario Draghi speaking or the Fed speaking about monetary policy, then you will find the same template. Right? They are speaking about objectives and goals, and they quantify and specify those goals for the near and far future. They provide forecasts and analysis of what's happening in the monetary markets or the financial markets. They announce and explain very clearly the decisions they have taken, and they also explain future policy course. And this is all important so the market can adjust their decisions into this framework without the need of actual costly enforcement. And when the question is like, how is this transparency or credibility through transparency created? There are three very important dimensions which have already been mentioned. It's very important that actually all the stakeholders, citizens, as well as firms understand what's happening, right? So there's a clear and high quality message without noise. It's very important that actually the stakeholders notice what's happening there. So it's making headline news or creating these points of focused attention. It seems to be super important. And also, it's very important that the people that you are talking to actually believe what you're saying, which requires a consistency between words and enforcement actions, credibility of the institution, and a very strong track record. So it's clear that these policy objectives or these policy tools cannot be achieved by talking to everyone with the same message. So firms, markets, politicians, the general audience, academics require different types of messages. But the whole point is that this probably requires a very strong strategic investment into building this type of power of the words, or the ability to do policy by speaking or through verbal interventions. But in the long run, I don't think that's something that DPAs can avoid doing.
I'm sure you have questions and comments to each other's presentation, but now it's time to open the floor for questions and answers, the question and answer sessions. So okay, you were first, and then Eduardo, and you, and please, okay, can I have a mic? And can you give it first to the lady here? And yes, raise your hand, please, again. And then to the gentleman to the left from our side.
Thank you very much. I have a question regarding the input, not only from the professional PR department, but from the other employees of the DPA, for example, inspectors or just other employees. Do you have guidance on what they can discuss either in an offline setting or an online setting, or I mean, how does that work? Would you rather have them withhold their personal opinions, or yeah?
Maybe Steve, could you respond to that if you have the mic, shortly if possible?
Yep, it's a good question, and as I said, we have an office of nearly 700 staff now as well, so it is an important area we do need to oversee. So generally, interactions with the media will be directed to our communications department, but we will put forward our expert staff, so our executive team, people like myself, will be put forward as spokespeople to do media interviews. So we don't only use our communications team to speak to the public. It's obviously very important that the Information Commissioner herself, Elizabeth Denham, speaks directly to the public. So we will use our staff. We have regular media training for our staff to make sure they understand how to interact and deal with different situations. We also do have a policy on how staff should use social media to make clear when they're using it in a personal capacity and making sure there isn't a crossover between personal views and things they do outside of work in their private lives and what they do in an ICO capacity. But when they're in an ICO capacity, they work within the approach we have. And it's about getting the key messages out and making sure equally those staff can come across as credible. We don't want them to come across as robots, and that doesn't give a credible message. Also, they're media trained, so they seem to be avoiding the question. We want to be clear, open, credible, and transparency from them. But that does take some training to make sure we get the key messages across.
What's the situation with you at the EDPB?
Yes,
you are a very small team.
It's very similar. The communications team is very small, obviously, but we do have a fairly big team of legal. The legal team is quite big,
and they can communicate
they're
directly.
the experts. They communicate, but they check back with us what issues are public, what not, and we always advise them to make it very clear when they're speaking in a personal capacity or on behalf of the EDPB.
Thank you. The next question, the gentleman sitting there. Can we have the spare mic, or you can use mine? Do you have another microphone? A spare microphone?
No,
emergency
it's
microphone?
I think it's working.
Okay, it was not on. Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm Eduardo Bertoni. I'm the director of the Access to Public Information Agency in Argentina, which is the DPA in Argentina. We have a similar structure of...
Let's change the mic, please. Let's use the other one.
Thank you.
Much better.
I was saying that our institutional design is very similar of the ICO, so we cover both access to public information and data protection. And since I am coming from Latin America, let me give you a very brief, comments about what's going on there. It's very interesting to hear, the relation between DPAs in the north with the media. In some way, it's very similar of what happened in our case. But currently, for example, we receive more coverage on cases on access to public information than on data protection. I think that the reason is corruption, because corruption is in the media all days in Latin America, and access to public information is something, it's one more tool to fight against corruption. The media is more attracted on what we are doing on access to public information than what we are doing on data protection. Having said that, sometimes we feel some sort of frustration, and I want to share with you because, for example, we have been working for almost 2 years, a little bit more, in a new bill for changing the Argentine data protection law. We call for meetings to the civil society, the academic sector, journalists, in a process to open, the process to everybody to receive information, comments about, what we need in terms of a new data protection law, and the media did not pay attention to that. Furthermore, when the president sent the bill to the Congress, no news. Nobody paid attention to the possibility to have in Argentina a new data protection law. I personally published an op-ed when the GDPR entered into force in May last year. The op-ed did not have many, visited in our website. So my feeling is that data protection is not an issue. It's not something general. It's not a news in our country. And finally, and then I will do a very brief question. For example, very recently we published a resolution making some sort of interpretation of the current law. We were happy because that resolution was well received by some journalists. The problem is how is the understanding or how they explain our resolution. One title was Big Media for Big Data for Everybody. And the resolution has nothing to do with big data. So we have that kind of concerns, that sometimes what we are doing on data protection is not very well understood by journalists. So my question is, should we not only give a clear message, I agree with you, but also to create some sort of training for journalists or doing something else, not just giving news, giving information, but also trying to create a space for training for journalists. Personally, we don't have the capacity. We have just one communication officer. But I don't know, and I don't know what to do on if you have some experience.
Thank you, Eduardo. Maybe we have time for one question. The young person sitting there. We collect not too many questions, and then I invite the panel, including the chair, to respond to all this. Yes, your question or comment.
Hello? Okay, well, thank you. Just a question in relation to the last speaker and the analogy with central bankers. And one of the key distinctions that you can make between DPAs and central bankers is that central bankers don't have an enforcement role. And I was just wondering, in relation to investigations, is the media seen as a tool? Or are there clear policies about not involving the media? So you see, for instance, in terms of, especially in relation to breaches, companies have lost, sort of share price has fallen significantly. So I just wondering, is the media seen as a tool for investigations?
Okay, thank you. Who would like to start responding? Maybe that was a question directed to you, more or less, about the... the banking metaphor or the...
So I'm not sure I understood. I heard your question very clearly, but what I understood is, can you use the media as an enforcement tool?
I think perhaps it's more a question for the EDPB in terms of. So, is the media seen as a tool for investigations and enforcement in terms of the information you give to the media can have very large effects on companies in terms of their share prices, etc. And I just wondered, is that something that's being thought about and there's a policy towards that aspect, and just how that interaction works?
Okay, Steve.
Yeah, I'm happy to say a little bit on that, and I think there are different dimensions when you're conducting investigations and doing enforcement where you work with the media. It's clearly a different scenario when an investigation is live compared to when an investigation is completed. So sometimes when an investigation is live, the policy approach we take will be we can only give limited information because we can't prejudice the investigation. And also we have the sort of, questions of procedural fairness to the organisations we're investigating at that point. So when Cambridge Analytica, the investigation was going on, the media wanted to know next day what we'd found on the servers we'd got from our late night raid. We obviously couldn't say anything at that point, and we followed the normal policy we have in that situation. We actually have a particular policy on communicating regulatory action, and that's on our website, which gives transparency to those who we regulate to make sure we're consistent, and that's, I think, a really important point. But once the fine's out, if we've issued a fine or an enforcement notice, we really do want to use the media as a tool because that gets the message out to all businesses. So if you fine one bank, then you want the other banks to learn from it as well. So it's really your duty as a DPA to get maximum coverage for a fine because it's partly about the wider messaging which comes with the fine. It's about that organisation learning from the fine, but we should exploit the opportunity to get the messages out. So it's different situations and different approaches.
Jennifer, could you respond to the question regarding the
I can also
education?
add that, in the media, we do feel it's our job to expose wrongdoing and shine the bright spotlight of public opinion on bad folks. But at the same time, we are beholden, we are subject to laws as well about libel and so forth. And if there is no proof, we can't be used as a tool. Fake news notwithstanding, we can't be used as a tool to sort of pursue someone when there's no proven case against them. In terms of whether you should provide training, yeah, why not? If there's the interest there for journalists who want to know about it, then, more information from our perspective is generally better. So if you can find journalists who are generally interested enough to come along and get the training, sure.
Your opinion about the training and education of journalists? Does it take
I agree with Jennifer, but I have one aside to make. Time is an issue very often. So you should, training journalists is all nice and well, but it should be in a way that they come away from the training and feel like they've really learned something that's relevant to them and that they can actually use. It will leave them with a good story that they can write about, not just some technical training about data protection rights.
Yeah, that's right. Do we still have a little time for questions? Okay, 2 more questions. First, you were the first, and then you the second one.
Thank you. Ruth Boardman from Bird & Bird. I think a lot of the comments that were made show positive relations between the media and data protection authorities. And I think Cambridge Analytica is a good example of where there's been a collaborative arrangement which works in the interests of media and data protection authorities. But it won't always be like that. And the spotlight, I think, might shift to comments about decisions that aren't received positively, criticisms perhaps about delays. So I was interested in knowing how data protection authorities especially are going to deal with adverse media. And the headline which I had in mind was another UK headline, which goes back to the days when Richard Thomas was the Information Commissioner and when he tried to raise the issue about journalists potentially breaching data protection legislation to get material. And there was a picture of Richard Thomas on one of the papers, and the headline was, "Is this the most dangerous man in Britain?" So I'd be interested in perspectives when things don't quite go so smoothly.
Okay, let's collect another question, and then try to respond.
Hello,
together.
Simon Hania. I'm Data Protection Officer at Uber. And I have a question related to expectations of a data protection officer from the media and from DPAs in this context. So is there anything a DPO can add to this mix?
Who would like to respond first? At which questions, please?
I'll be critical because that's what we do. I mean, journalists should be treated with caution, and I say that as a journalist. I mean, you know, some of us are very ethical and responsible, but some of my colleagues aren't. And so, you know, I'll ask for a quote. I'll let you check your quote if I'm feeling very generous, but I'm not going to let you read the rest of the article before it's published. So, I mean, obviously, I would say DPAs and DPOs should be aware of that. I mean, I do have criticisms and concerns. I mean, I recently spent a long time trying to get figures and data on GDPR complaints, and there's no, I mean, the EDPB is actually particularly good at managing media and responding quickly, but, you know, I contacted every single DPA. I said, what's, you know, 6 months in, what's the GDPR complaints number from your jurisdiction? Some of them responded within 2 days. Some of them responded 5-6 weeks after my article was already published, and there was no consistency between what they were giving me. So, you know, I will treat with caution the responses from some. I mean, we learn, and I learn who I can trust and who I can't trust. So, yeah, that's my feedback on why we might be critical sometimes.
If I may add something to the DPA, DPO question. 2 or 3 years ago, I don't quite remember, we had a panel, a similar panel in the series of DPAs and something panels at CPDP on the relationship of DPAs and DPOs. And there's a common misunderstanding, maybe it's not that common nowadays. The DPOs are kind of internal enemies or built-in paid enemies inside the companies who will call the DPA's attention if something is wrong inside the company. I think it's not true, but I don't want to give the answer. Please respond to the question and to the other question to the lady. Or tell me if you don't agree with this, that DPOs should call the attention to the DPAs immediately if something is wrong, instead of fixing it. Who would like to say anything about this? Maybe it was too sharp. No, then other questions, the last question, and then we have to wrap up soon, if you have any comments or questions. If not, then I give the floor back to the chair for his closing comments.
Thank you very much. We're probably the only panel in the history of CPDP which has avoided the bell ringer. Whether that tells anything, I don't know. I certainly have learned quite a lot today, and I think and I hope that the audience has as well. We've had really kind of inside stories about what it's like to be a working journalist and how a working journalist thinks about covering these issues and dealing with DPAs in the process of doing that. We've also had quite a lot of very informative material from our two DPA speakers about just what happens behind the office door within data protection authorities, how they handle the press strategies, the tactics, the communication, and so on, how advantage is taken of scandals and events out there, because that is what creates not only newsworthiness, but also creates opportunities for regulators to do the job that they're meant to do. It makes me think we have been living in what we can call interesting times. When times become less interesting, then perhaps DPAs will recede into the gray mists and wonder where their publicity might be coming from. And I think I'm ancient enough to remember exceptionally quiet times when nobody ever heard of something like a DPA or an ICO in the UK and so on. And it was never, even on the last page of the paper, it has to do with football, but it never had anything to do with anything on the front page. Now you can't get away from privacy, data protection, the ICO in the UK as GDPR as headline items. And we also had, I think, a very good contribution to put this into perspective about a communication process, the who, what, when, where, how, and to whom, by way of trying to analyze, if we wanted to take the question further, analyze the role of the media in relationship to and the communication processes of DPAs. So I think, I hope you'll go away more enlightened about what happens and also more reflective of what these relationships could be. You've been a very good audience. You voted correctly in all cases. And I wanted to thank not only the panel, of course, and Yvonne as the excellent moderator, but also you for coming over here this morning and taking part in the panel. So let's give a round of applause to everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.